Hi there guys, got a video here for you today on the AGT Vixen, and what we're going to be doing in today's video is fully rebuilding the rifle. So in our previous video we took the rifle apart. What I've gone ahead and done is taken a few measurements, changed out all the O-rings, and now we're ready to put the rifle back together. Before we begin, I do very briefly want to mention that if you need any O-rings for your AGT Vixen, a full list is available in the back of the manual, so I'll get you a good look at that there, just so you can pause the video and take a note of any O-rings if you need them. Now to start off with the rebuild, we're going to be assembling the valve, and before the valve goes in, I just very briefly want to mention about the valve face seal. So the valve face, this piece here, is made out of Delrin, and it forms a mechanical seal against the valve seat, which is in the block. The seal between these two components needs to be good, or you'll have a constant leak of air emanating from the end of the barrel. If you have a leak of air coming from the end of the barrel, what you're going to need to do is clean the valve face up. So hopefully you can see on camera there, but we have an outer shiny ring and an inner dull ring. The outer ring is the piece that the valve is sealing on, so if that face there has any scratches, any debris or any marks in it, it's not going to seal within the block. To clean the valve faces up, what I normally do is poke the valve stem through a piece of wet or dry sandpaper, and then nice and carefully rotate the edge around to polish the sealing edge. What I would typically do if I had a problem is use about 1200 grit wet or dry and then move up through the grits until there was no scratches left on the valve face and it was a nice finish. Now, AGT Vixens aren't known to have any valve issues or anything like that, so I just wanted to mention that just for your information. With that said, the first thing we're going to do to kick off the rebuild is get the valve installed into the block. So we're just going to get the valve along with the valve return spring put in. Then we can add the valve cap O-ring, this piece here. And before this goes in, I am just going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to the outside of the O-ring. With that done, we can get that put into its seat and then cap that off with our cover. So the cover has a small counterbore in the top there, and the valve return spring needs to be seated in the counterbore. With that in position, we can get our screws installed. I'll just get you a quick look at the screws there, just standard countersunk bolts. Getting those done up nice and tightly with a 2.5mm Allen key. Up next, we're going to be getting the pellet probe and the cocking arm installed into the block, and to start off with, we're going to be taking this return spring here and dropping that through that hole in the back there. With that done, we can take our pellet probe, this piece here, and add a small amount of lithium grease to the top and the bottom of the probe. Just a real small amount will do us on this piece here. We'll just wipe off the excess with our fingers. Then we can get that pushed through the back of the block. Getting that roughly aligned with the middle for now. The next thing we'll do is add this cover. So this cover goes on the opposite side to what you're going to put your cocking arm onto. So for example, I'm going to have my cocking on the right hand side of the rifle, so I'm going to be installing the cover on the left hand side. What we need to do is align this thick side, or this thick end I should say, with the back side of the pellet probe. And if we take a look on the probe, we have 3 holes. The 2 back ones are the ones we're going to screw the 2 screws into. And we're going to be getting those screws done up with a 2.5mm Allen key. The next thing we can do is get our cocking arm installed. To begin with, we'll take our cocking arm and add a small amount of lithium grease to both the top and the bottom of the pivot there. What I'm going to do then is take one of the small washers or shim washers and stick that to the top. The shim washers on this particular rifle were the same thickness, so we don't have to worry about getting a top and a bottom. But what I am going to do is just add a very small extra amount of lithium grease to the top of the washer, Then we can get that slid into the block, lining the two holes up with this hole in the back of the block. Once we have that done, we can take our pivot, this piece here, add a small amount of lithium grease to the shaft, then get that installed. We're not pushing that through all the way just yet. We'll leave it a little proud, and I will mention that I have already pre-loosened the locking grub screw in the bottom here using a 1.5mm Allen key. What I'll do now is take the other shim washer, this one here, add a little bit of lithium grease to both the top and the bottom of the washer, and get that put onto the bottom of the arm. Now this is a little tricky to do as the washer is a fairly snug fit within the block, so I'm just going to be using a nice small flat bladed screwdriver to manipulate it into position. After a little bit of fiddling, the pivot point should find its way through the hole, then we can just do it up nice and tight with a 2mm Allen key. The next thing we'll do is lock that off using the grub screw in the bottom, and that's done using a 1.5mm Allen key. And finally we can connect the cocking arm to the pellet probe. To do that, we're going to be installing this screw here along with the small spring washer. With that tight, we can make sure the pellet probe goes backwards and forwards nice and smoothly, so I'm quite happy with that. The next thing we can do is get the rest of the action installed. With that all done, we can now install the hammer, hammer spring adjuster, as well as the trigger and the trigger guard. Now to begin with, we're just going to be dropping the hammer through the back, so through this hole in the back of the action. Then we can get that topped off with our hammer spring. And then finally put the hammer spring adjuster in the back. For now we're just going to be screwing the hammer adjuster in flush with the back of the block, and then we can adjust the power at a later date. You can also install the hammer spring adjuster lock using a 2mm Allen key. And the lock just goes through this hole here. We're not going to be getting that done up just yet, we'll leave it loose for now. The next thing we will do is add our trigger. So it just drops into place. Then we can secure that using these two small countersunk silver screws. Getting those done up with a T10 Torx bit. With those done up nice and tight, we can check that the rifle cocks and fires as it should, so I'm quite happy there. The last thing we'll add is our trigger guard. So there's our trigger guard there. It just slots into position. Then we have the two screws. The short one goes towards the front and the long one goes towards the back. And both get done up using a 2mm Allen key. Right then, next thing we'll do is finish off the mechanical side of the rifle, then we'll move over to the pressurized side. To begin with, we're going to be installing our barrel, and to do that, we're going to first remove this grub screw from the block. And we're also going to open our cocking arm slightly. What we can do then is take our barrel and align this dimple in the top of the barrel up with this hole in the top of the block. Once we have things aligned, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see down there, but everything looks aligned to the naked eye, we can take our grub screw and a 3mm Allen key and get that done up. Before you do it up tight, just make sure the barrel is locked so it can rotate slightly there, but there isn't much movement, and that indicates that the grub screw is correctly seated within the dimple. We can then get both the grub screws done up nice and tight. The next thing I'll do is just install the shroud to get it out my way. And then we can install the top rail, so this piece here. All we need to do is align the top rail up with the block, then install the 3 securing screws. As you do the screws up, just use your fingers to feel the gap between the block and the top rail, and just make sure it's even as you do the screws up. And we're going to be getting those screws done up nice and tightly using a 3mm Allen key. The last thing we can install is the bottom rail, and it just goes on the bottom of the block. Getting that put into position, then we're going to be installing that using the 2 securing screws. With that done, that's pretty much the mechanical side of the block fully complete. The other thing we could install if we wanted to is the grip. However, as we do need to loosen the hammer spring locking screw at the back here, I'm going to be leaving that off for now. I will mention, however, that it is a standard AR-15 style grip, so you could swap it over to something like an Ergo Chubby if you wanted to. Right then, with that all said and done, we can move over to the pressurized side of the rifle, starting off with the regulator. I will say I have gone through and replaced all of the O-rings off camera, and I've also gone ahead and restacked the Belleville washers. So if we take a look at the Belleville washers there, you can see that there are 10 on this particular rifle. They are stacked in pairs and in alternating sets. So what that means is that they're cupped 2 one way, 2 the other way, all the way along, with the odd 2 being cupped down towards the end of the piston, so towards this piece here. With that said, we can start getting things installed. To begin with, we're going to be taking our regulator piston, adding a small amount of silicone grease to the top and bottom O-ring. And then I'm also going to be adding a small amount of dry lube to the washers. This is a totally optional step. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. I just like to run a little bit of dry lube on my Belleville washers. So there we have it, just a small amount of dry lube on the washers. Then we can go ahead and get that installed into the regulator body. Pushing that nicely into place. You could also install it just using the M4 screw, screwing that into the back of the piston and pushing it in, but I think I've got it with my pinky finger there. Up next, we're going to be adding the back cap, this piece here, and again, small amount of silicone grease around the O-ring. This one is quite tight within the housing, so I'm just going to add a little bit extra, just so it slides nicely over the threads. With that done, we can get that pushed into the back, and then use a 4mm Allen key to get that done up nice and tightly. Finishing that off with a 17mm spanner across the flats of the regulator, and getting that done up nice and tightly. The final thing we can add is the regulator adjuster, so this piece here, and again, small amount of silicone grease around the O-ring, and getting that installed. Now in the disassembly video, I did take the total measurement across the regulator, and that on this rifle was set to around 61mm. 61mm on this particular regulator equated to a 110 bar set pressure. I will say, however, that's not going to be consistent across all rifles. Differences in both regulator construction and Belleville washer thickness will slightly change between rifles. So on this particular regulator, 61mm across the entire length of the regulator equates to 110 bar. However, that may be different for your rifle. And I will say at this point, it is a standard regulator, so the further you wind the adjuster screw in, the lower the reg pressure will be, and the further out you wind it, the higher the reg pressure will be. From my testing, it seems to be about 0.1 of a millimeter change in the overall length is equating to about 10 bar of pressure change. So for example, 61mm across the total length of the regulator would be 110, 61.1 would be 120. I will say though that is a rather rough estimation, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. The next thing we're going to do is get our locking nut pre-installed. We're just going to be leaving this loose for now, but we will take the measurement across the ends. So 61.8, we need to go in a little more. So there we have it. It takes a little bit of fiddling around to get the setting exactly right, but once you have it where you want it, you can use a 10mm spanner to lock the locking nut and set the adjustment. Before we put the regulator back in the rifle, I am just going to chuck it in my reg tester to make sure the pressure is roughly where I want it. Right then, so we've got the regulator set up in the reg tester. We've got a digital gauge over here, and as you can see, the current set pressure is about 112 bar, so I'm quite happy with that. That should bed in quite nicely, and once everything's said and done, it should be set around 110. With that said, we'll get this bled out and we'll get it installed back into the housing. Right then, with the regulator rebuilt, we can now build the regulator housing back up again. To begin with, we'll be adding the regulator, and to this we're just going to add a small amount of silicone grease around these external O-rings here, and then this one at the front as well. And we can get that pushed through the housing. Pushing it nice and firmly until it pops into position. The next thing we'll do is add the one-way valve. So this is the filler valve, this piece here. We're going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to the outside O-ring. And we're going to be getting it installed into this hole here, into the top hole. This is a stainless steel component, so I'm just going to be installing that using a set of tweezers to begin with. And what I do with these is do them up until they stop, then back them out about 1/4 of a turn. That seems to work quite nicely. Up next we're going to be adding the gauge, and again to the O-ring just a small amount of silicone grease. And we're getting that screwed over the top. And we're just going to be getting the gauge done up nice and tightly with an adjustable spanner. To that I'm also going to be adding just a gauge cover, just to hide the chrome edge of that gauge there. We also have the filler plug which we can install, although we're going to need to remove this in a minute anyway, so I'll leave that out. Before I forget, I am also going to be tightening the bleed screw on the side of the block, and that's done using a 2mm Allen key. Right then, with that done, we're almost done with the rebuild. The next thing we're going to do is add the regulator housing to the main block, and then add the bottle onto the back. To begin with, we'll make sure our O-ring in the back here is seated, and I am going to put a little bit of silicone grease over the O-ring again, so just that one in the back there. Then we can take our housing and get the 3 screws dropped into it. These are all the same length, so you can't get them mixed up. Then we're going to add that to the back block and get the screws done up using a 3mm Allen key. As you get them bolts done up, just make sure the block itself is going on nice and evenly and that the block is not misaligned with the main action. With that done, we can add the bottle to the back, and before that goes in, I am just going to add a small amount of silicone grease to this O-ring around the base of the threads. With that all done, we can just start adding the last final pieces, like the neoprene bottle cover to the back, as well as the butt piece as well. Right then, so that's the rifle fully built back up again. The next thing we need to do is get some air into it. So I've got my whip connected here along with my filler probe. I'm going to install that into the back of the block. We're also going to cock the rifle. This will alleviate any and all hammer preload against the valve, and it should make filling the rifle a little easier. Now I will say at this point, if air starts to leak out the end of the barrel, don't panic. Just give the rifle a little time to gas up, and hopefully after a few seconds or so, reg pressure will force the valve closed. So let's open the bottle and see what happens. Right then, so I don't know if the camera is going to pick that up or not, but as soon as I started to fill the rifle, there was a hollow sort of whistling sound coming from the end of the barrel. After 5 or so seconds, that stopped, and that's just because regulator pressure built up within the plenum and it forced the valve closed. With that said, we still will need to leak test the rifle overnight, but for now I'm going to set the power using the hammer spring on the back of the rifle, and that can be adjusted nice and easily by first loosening the locking screw, so this piece here. Then we can adjust the hammer spring using an Allen key or something similar in the holes and twisting it either way. Increasing spring tension will up the power, and decreasing spring tension will lower the power. Right then, after a little bit of sodding around with the chronograph, I've managed to set the power on the rifle. At the moment it's shooting at around 780 feet per second when using JSB 8.44 grain pellets, and when swapping over to the JSB heavies, so the 10.34 grain heavies, it's shooting at around 715 feet per second on average. When using a magazine, the extreme feet per second spread is sitting at around 9, which when you consider that I'm using unweighed unsalted pellets straight through a magazine in a recently rebuilt gun, I think that's pretty good. That will probably bed in a little bit, but I'm quite happy with that, because the main thing that tells us is that there's nothing majorly wrong with the rifle and it's ready to take down range and test fully. With that said, I have already gone ahead and locked off the hammer spring adjustment, and the last thing we can do is install the grip. So I'm going to be replacing the original hard plastic grip with a new Ergo chubby grip. So this one here, it's the soft touch one, or the sort of rubberized one, so it's a little more comfortable, and I quite like the thicker grips. It can be installed using exactly the same grip bolt, and it's the same procedure for either the hard plastic one or the rubberized one. And there we have it. So there's the grip installed on the Vixen, and the Vixen is pretty much fully rebuilt. So with that all said, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting or useful, and I'll see you in the next one.